Hello again, YouTube, for today's Friday segment, which, if you know what that means, it means today's a movie review. So here's the fun stuff. I've gotten by far the best reviews on movie reviews, but I decided to take a week off to get settled into college, into my dorm room, all that jazz so because it's a Friday, I just got out of school, and so my brain is somewhere between well done and burnt. So hopefully this doesn't come out to be a complete catastrophe. So the movie I'm going to be reviewing today is Air Force One, starring Harrison Ford and Gary Oldman. So to get started, the director of the movie is Wolfgang Peterson. He also did In the Line of Fire, which he sort of steals from himself in this movie in a lot of places, which I'll talk about. I watched the director's commentary about a week ago, so there's some nice little information from his side about it. So, the theme of the movie, general synopsis before I get into the blow by blow, just like I did with The Last Samurai. General synopsis is that there is a former Soviet politician in Kazakhstan who wants to um, reunite the Soviet Empire and um, basically reignite the Cold War. And so they go in, they arrest this guy, and this group of Russian terrorists who support this politician hijack Air Force One and attempt to blackmail the president of the United States to have the Russian president release this prisoner. So, that's the general synopsis of or not synopsis, but a general overview of what the plot of the movie is. So the movie starts out in Kazakhstan or Kazakhstan. It's actually being filmed over Cleveland, Ohio. It's real. It's a real paratrooper scene, though. These are real parachute stuntmen just being filmed over Ohio. They go in and they arrest this Kazakhstani politician who is still holds the old Soviet communist ideals and is wanting to overthrow the Kazakhstani government. If you notice that the actor who plays Radek is what he's called in the movie, is the main character from Das Boot, which Wolfgang Peterson was involved in as well. He's sort of making a shout out to himself by casting that particular person to be in this little cameo. So they arrest this politician, and nice little pyrotechnics right at the end. And then the next scene is the President of the United States being congratulated on the scene. There were 27 drafts of this scene, of what's called the Be Afraid speech. If you go to your scene selection in the DVD, it's called the Be Afraid speech. I believe that's what it's called, at least. So there were 27 drafts of this scene, and this scene is pretty much what separates Air Force One from being just another action movie, from being something like In the Line of Fire, starring Clint Eastwood. Another thing is that this scene, I would say, could only be pulled off by an actor like Harrison Ford, because the movie was actually originally written with Kevin Costner in mind as playing Harrison Ford's role as the President of the United States. I don't know why they decided to do it that way. I always had fantasies, just like In the Line of Fire. I've always had fantasies about the president's role being played by Clint Eastwood, because there's a few lines in there that have to be delivered a little gruffly, like "Get off my plane," that I think Clint Eastwood would be a bit better suited for, just kind of in a fun guy way of thinking about things. But so the after the president's speech, they get on to the namesake of the movie, the president's plane, Air Force One, and then posing as a Russian news crew, Gary Oldman and his team gain access onto Air Force One, and they are given a tour of the plane and all that stuff. They're playing their role pretty well as being a Russian news crew. And so then there's just some typical politics stuff in there. And there was another thing that Wolfgang Peterson said that he wasn't sure about was what football team the president should be rooting for. So he just decided to go with Kennedy's favorite football team, which was, of course, Notre Dame. And just little things like that to try to get like a picture in the life of a president, both politically and socially. I mean, within his family and whatnot, is taking a few scenes to sort of establish what kind of character Harrison Ford is. So, In the Line of Fire got Wolfgang Peterson a lot of positive review from the Secret Service. This movie, not so much. So the thing is that the guy who kind of kicks it all off and gives the Russian terrorists or Kazakhstani terrorists their big break, I'll just call them Russians for the sake of easiness to understand. The Russian terrorists, their break in order to hijack Air Force One, it's a Secret Service agent. Not only does he give them their big break by opening up the armory on board Air Force One, he kills 3 of his colleagues before doing so. Yeah, not the best way for Mr. Peterson to make his impression upon the Secret Service after, basically giving them a standing O with In the Line of Fire. So the terrorists take control of the plane, and one of the things that I find so amazing about this movie is that there actually are no real holes in the plot. Like a lot of movies, especially action movies, require a great deal of suspension of reality. That a lot of it has to be stupidity drives the plot, or totally unrealistic physics, but you just gotta go with it in order to get where you're going in the story. This actually takes a lot of things into consideration. So there is a firefight on Air Force One, which if you've ever at least seen the movie Goldfinger, you would know that firing a gun on an airplane would reduce cabin pressure and basically start sucking people out of the plane. But Air Force One is bullet resistant, so there actually could be a firefight on Air Force One. So I'm not sure if I'm, revealing any national secrets. I mean, I guess if I know it, then it can't be too highly classified by just, having a cursory knowledge of certain things to do with the president and whatnot. So there actually could be a firefight on Air Force One. So in this firefight, the Secret Service go and they lead the president down into below deck into the storage area of Air Force One, and they put him into an escape pod. Now, this escape pod is something that is most likely fictional. There is no declassified information about the escape pod. It could or it could not exist. Most of Air Force One's features have to remain classified for the purposes of national security. So they can't just go around revealing, top secret information just to make a buck off of entertaining people for a night. So he gets into this escape pod, and he goes to the and the Secret Service agents and the Russian terrorists have a back and forth, and eventually the Russian terrorists take down the Secret Service agent because the terrorists are wearing Kevlar and have superior firepower, and they go and they see that the escape pod has been deployed, so they're seeing their mission of capturing the president as being failed. So after the firefight, the the terrorists are saying that oh, we failed to capture the president, so now we just have these 50 useless hostages to try to negotiate something with. And then the Air Force goes to find the escape pod, which had been deployed, but they don't find anything. Okay, so rewinding a little bit, there is one scene worthy of mentioning, and that's something that Wolfgang Petersen is very proud of in his 1997 film work, is that they were very proud of their ability to switch between a real plane, a model plane, and a digital plane. And this is something that Wolfgang Petersen in the director's commentary is just going nuts about, is how difficult it is to pull this off. And so he's constantly saying, if you watch the director's commentary, he's like, and this is the real plane, and this is the digital plane, and this is the real plane again, this is the model plane, and it's pretty much the model plane, except right here there's the real plane, and then it's the model plane again. And it's just really kind of hilarious. I mean, for me, watching the director's commentary in 2015, whenever like my senior year of high school was whenever the movie Avatar came out, where 3D technology had just been taken to an all new height, and then to hear some guy talking in 1998 peeing himself about being able to switch between digital model and real airplanes. It's just kind of funny. So the terrorists believe that they don't have it. The terrorists believe that he's escaped, and the Air Force finds that he didn't escape. What did he do? He hid out because this is an action movie. So the thing he tries to do is he tries to basically do a bunch of sabotage operations to get to ultimately to his family is what he's concerned about. But the other the other 47 to 48 hostages are somewhat important because America. So the first thing that he does is he tries to lure away the person guarding the door to the conference room where all the hostages are being held. And he does this in a lot of clever different ways by, timing out patrols and things like that. So as the terrorist guarding the door has his back turned, he runs into his office, and then he, turns up the television with the Notre Dame game on, and so you see something's up, and so it's this little sneaky back and forth. And then finally, they end up meeting with each other. And the thing is that this extra has a stunt double. But Harrison Ford did not have a stunt double throughout this whole fight scene that ensues between, real... Harrison Ford is taking real punches to the face, is taking, a lot of different things. He does not stunt double out. He does not pansy out at all during this movie. In fact, I'll get to that scene later, but there was one scene that actually caused like a whole side of his face to become swollen during filming. It's actually kind of impressive to hear the story, similar to, as I didn't mention this in The Last Samurai, but during The Last Samurai, whenever the sword fight scene in the rain, Tom Cruise was actually taking real hits and it was actually raining. So he was actually down for like 2 days after filming that with hypothermia. So a lot of these A-list actors do really go above and beyond the Call of Duty a lot of times. So there's this fight scene that ensues, and he, knocks out the Russian terrorist. He takes the keys and he tries to open up the conference room, but the Russian terrorist comes back too, and having taken the terrorist's gun, he shoots the terrorist and he dies, but he just fired a gun, which is gonna make a noise. And so now all of the Russian terrorists up in the upper deck are now totally aware that there is someone that they need to hunt down. They initially think it's a Secret Service agent because they believe that the president's escaped in his little escape pod. So there's some other back and forth, and there's another funny guy who is an extra in this that Wolfgang Peterson says is often trying to look like what's the guy's name from The Godfather who plays Vito Corleone? Marlon Brando. So is this Russian extra is just trying to look like Marlon Brando the whole time, and it's kind of funny that he mentions that because it's kind of true. So there's some more back and forth, like Harrison Ford's character finds a satellite phone, which again, looking at the technology in this movie from the perspective of 2015, looking at 1997, is hilarious. So he finds this big fat satellite phone, and he calls the White House switchboard so he can get in touch with the presidential cabinet. And there's this funny back and forth between him and the person in the White House switchboard as he's actively being hunted by one of the terrorists, and he can see the terrorist hunting him, but he still manages to stay hidden for long enough. And then he manages to get in contact with the presidential cabinet right as the Russian terrorist finds him. So the terrorist actually doesn't see that he has a cell phone, and he slips it into his pocket. And so he's talking to the terrorist like he's talking into the cell phone, but he's doing it in this cryptic way that the terrorist can't actually tell that he's talking actually to the presidential cabinet on the satellite phone. And it just really sounds like, to the terrorist, like he's just talking nonsense. So this is another kind of step in the president's sabotage campaign against the actual aircraft of Air Force One to try to force them to land. So the thing that he does is he sort of cryptically orders the cabinet to fire a missile at Air Force One because the countermeasures will automatically take effect. The flares will go up, the missile will be attracted to the heat of the flare rather than to the heat of the engine, and the most that will happen to the aircraft is a shock wave. And so the cabinet is smart enough to understand that this is an order from the president, so they order the F-15s to fire on Air Force One, and they do so, and that's how Harrison Ford manages to get away from his captor, is that he uses the shock wave to get into a kind of a gunfight and then slash fist fight, and he then chokes out the Russian guy and ends up breaking his neck. But all the while in the cabinet, all they're hearing is grunts and groans, so they don't know who's going to win this fight. And hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll be the good guy that wins the fight. So the So he manages to break the terrorist's neck, and then he gets back on the phone. He's like, "This is the president." He's like, "Yay, America moment!" But the he is informed of the situation and a little bit better from how the terrorist and the vice president had a phone call earlier. Um, this requires me to rewind a little bit in there. So there was a phone call between the vice president and the terrorist leader, played by Gary Oldman, earlier, and basically his demands were made that this political prisoner be released. And characteristically of almost all of Glenn Close's characters throughout the 90s, she just had to put her foot in her mouth. And she said, "What assurances do I have that you'll keep your word?" And to which Gary Oldman responded, "Until confirmation comes that General Reddick has been released. Until then, I will execute one hostage every half an hour. You have my word." So, yeah, so they're basically have a hostage execution policy that every half hour that General Raddick's not released, they're going to kill another hostage. By the time Harrison Ford is making this phone call, they've already killed one hostage. It was the national security advisor, because he was saying that, in our system of government, the vice president can't really do anything without talking to somebody like me. So he was actually trying to um, negotiate the situation. And he's doing this as the terrorist leader is on the phone line with the vice president. And whenever he shoots him, he says a line that I almost want to say is for comic relief, but it's still one of those gut wrenching things, especially for 90s cinema, 1990s cinema. He says, "Your national security advisor has just been executed. He's a very good negotiator. He just bought you another half hour." So, um, that's it's like I said, it's gut wrenching, but at the same time, it's almost like it's intended for comic relief, but it's sort of not sure. Um, Gary Oldman got the nickname among the cast of Air Force One as Scary Gary, because every situation that he's in this movie, he's just a really scary guy. And so, going back to the telephone call between the president and the vice president on the satellite phone, he basically says, we're not going to negotiate, because if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. Those are the exact words used in the movie. So they decide, okay, we're not going to negotiate with these guys. And so they um, continue through, and then Gary Oldman, aka Scary Gary, gets this idea in his head to try to flush out this Secret Service agent that's in the baggage area. And the way that he does it is that he takes a hostage that probably the most likable person in the whole movie. I mean, she's just kind of along the lines of like an extra, but probably the most likable person in the movie, and says that if the Secret Service agent doesn't surrender himself, he's going to shoot this nice woman. And so he gives the Secret Service agent 10 seconds to surrender himself. And so he's trying to figure out a way out of this scenario, but it's just not going to work out for him. And the um, person ends up being killed. And another thing that's interesting about this is that there was an actual shot, a camera shot of Gary Oldman shooting this extra character named Melanie Mitchell, actually shooting her, a bullet going in her, the front of her head, and her, head going back. But Wolfgang Peterson decided that that was too much. Again, 1997 versus 2015. In 2015, they would have been like, yeah, let's make it gory. Let's, do this. But, you wouldn't get an NC-17 rating nowadays for doing something like that. But back then, that was something that was on the table, and a lot of directors were afraid of that. So they actually held back some of the gore that was originally shot for the movie. So the sort of this idea that, again, sort of reinforcing that the president's really in it for his family, and a lot of the other hostages are just kind of expendable. So he ends up getting deciding that he wants to force the airplane to lose fuel. Again, this is all of his strategies are just to sabotage the airplane itself. I mean, he's kind of taking out the terrorist team like man by man. Thus far, I think his body counts up to like 2, but he goes into the crosswire switches, and he's on the phone with the Air Force, and they're saying, cut the green wire, and so he cuts the green wire, and then he loses signal, and like the battery dies, which everybody in the 90s was apparently familiar with your cell phone battery dying. So he then has the option. So the wires are green, yellow, red, white, and blue. And so he's already cut the green wire. So the other options to cut are yellow and red, white, and blue. And Wolfgang Petersen decides to put in some American symbolism where he decides to cut the yellow wire and leave the red, white, and blue wire intact. It's, again, trying to go with the patriotic theme that this movie takes on, and a lot of action movies of the 90s tend to take on, was a lot of patriotic symbolism. So he cuts the yellow wire, and okay, so the engine fuse of the plane didn't get cut, and it's not going to crash, so he crosses those wires, and it causes the fuel dump to occur. And so they have to send a team of 2 guys down stairs to correct this fuel dump. And so the terrorists send 2 guys downstairs. They have a little firefight, and they end up correcting the fuel dump. And so another thing that they find looking through, that the terrorist group finds looking through their press kit, is that there is a midair refueling option, and they twist the vice president's arm into agreeing to this midair refueling. But this actually ends up working in the advantage of the president and the hostages later, and I'll get to that. So the thing with the refueling situation, and they sent those 2 guys downstairs, and with the firefight, after the 2 guys were in the switchboard room, he hit the president, Harrison Ford's character, hid under the stairs, and the person who was guarding the door asked if everything was all right down there, and the president, Harrison Ford's character, which was already established in the Be Afraid speech, speaks a little bit of Russian, says, "He's dead, come help us." So the guy who was guarding the door comes downstairs. Again, very airtight plot. So whenever the guys come up from the switchboard room, or from whatever you call the room where he crossed the wires and whatnot, they ask if everything's all right, and he says, the person guarding the door says it's fine, but then the camera zooms out, and you see that Harrison Ford's character actually has a gun on him. And so he goes and he unlocks the conference room, and so they now have, 2 guns, and they are going to try to formulate an escape plan. And they were talking about, have you tried to force them to land the plane? He's like, yeah, I tried dumping fuel, but now they're going to refuel it with the mid-air tanker. And they're like, well, actually, this can work out to our advantage. If we can get a message to the refueling tanker telling them to drop to 15,000 feet and slow to 200 knots, we can jump. And so it's like, okay, yeah, let's try to do that. And then it's just like, well, how are we going to do that? The phone lines are out. And then this nice little extra, which actually had a very small part to begin with, but the casting liked her so much that they decided to expand her role a little bit, just a little bit. Says that there's a difference between voice lines and faxes, and so that they can fax out the information even if the phone lines are down, because it is a very common misconception that voice lines and faxes are connected, and if you unhook one, it's very easy to overlook the other. So Harrison Ford's character then gives her kind of a snide remark saying, if this works, you get to be Postmaster General. And so I'm not sure how the current Postmaster General would have felt about that if that were a reality situation. But anyway, they get the message through the fax machine, and they go down to the cockpit of the airplane, and the message gets to the Air Force, and the Air Force gives the terrorists the message that in order to refuel this thing, you're going to have to drop to 15,000 feet and slow to 200 knots. And so they're like, okay, yes, confirmed, acknowledged. And they don't know that that's what they call in cinema or in theater dramatic irony. It's where the audience knows something that a character in the film doesn't know. So they then, get the plane to 15,000 feet, 200 knots, and hostages start jumping. So whenever the cargo bay opens, this comes up on the computer in the cockpit, and they send down, and the terrorists send down a man to figure out what's going on down there. And so by the time that the terrorist actually manages to get into the room where the hostages are jumping out of the airplane, they have pretty much almost all the hostages are out by then. And the terrorists, though, it's sort of a mixed bag that the terrorists have lost the hostages, but at this point they've gained the president. So now they have the president. They can really get down to business of what they were wanting to do in the first place. Oh yeah, they also discovered that the president was probably still on board whenever there was a conference there was a White House conference to correct a news report that Air Force One had crashed. They just had to tell them that Air Force One had been hijacked. Ooh, big difference. But anyway, and a lot of the press conference, the director said, was based on the press conference after the Reagan shooting. That there was a White House intern being like, I don't know what's going on. Don't ask me anything. I cannot confirm anything or deny anything. And it's kind of funny to sort of connect those two in historical light. But they now have the president, and now Harrison Ford and Gary Oldman can have their little showdown to determine what's going to happen with what the terrorist's real demands are. Is he going to crack and negotiate, or is he gonna be a martyr? So the terrorist, first then takes it out on him for, killing a bunch of his men. And this is actually the scene that caused Harrison Ford's face to become swollen, was taking these shots from little old scary Gary. He's kind of a short guy, but apparently he packs a wallop because he gave Harrison Ford a bit of a shiner on the set. So he is saying, you've been busy downstairs killing my men, after he has like his hands duct taped behind his back. Says, you've been very busy downstairs killing my men. And so he starts, beating up on him. And he pushes him to the ground as Gary Oldman's spilling off all this, Soviet patriotism, saying you've given our countries away to gangsters and prostitutes, and this is an infection that you call freedom without meaning, and blah, blah, blah. So, but whenever he pushes him to the ground, he sees that there's broken glass on the floor. Again, really airtight plot. So there's broken glass on the floor, most likely that occurred during the shootings, whenever the terrorists initially took over the plane. So, the way that Gary Oldman's character finally gets the president to concede to giving up Radek is he puts a gun to his daughter's head, which his wife and his daughter are on the plane. He puts a gun to his daughter's head and says, I'll count to 5, and if you don't agree to call the president of Russia and say to release this prisoner, then I'm going to shoot her. And the thing is that Wolfgang Petersen was very impressed with this performance on Harrison Ford's end, but I wasn't. It was good acting, but it wasn't like the Oscar-nominated acting that Wolfgang Petersen was talking about, because this one scene, though, is something that, again, brings the movie into, something deeper than just an action movie. But I personally didn't see in Harrison Ford's face and eyes, and he had a brand new granddaughter born the year that this film was being that this movie was being filmed. He had a brand new granddaughter being born. He has kids. He knows the fatherly instinct just in his heart. He doesn't have to act it out. He knows it, but I did not see in his face and eyes, that's my little girl. So that is the problem that I, have with people really aggrandizing that scene, is I just did not see that in his face. I could see him trying to summon it, but he really didn't sell me on don't touch my little girl. So that was my personal criticism of that scene and whatnot. But he eventually, because of this threat, he agrees to contact the Russian president, and then the political prisoner is released, and he says to the terrorist guy, what are you going to do with us now? He's like, well, now we're going to figure out how else to use you now that we know that you're willing to negotiate. And so you see Harrison Ford's character take a piece of broken glass and start to slice away at the duct tape at his wrists, the broken glass that he got from the floor when he was pushed down. So you have this moment of triumph for the terrorists, this brief moment of triumph for the terrorists. And and again, a lot of the sets made in the movie Air Force One are actually found in Cleveland, Ohio. And even this political prison that you would imagine that you can only find a hellhole like this somewhere in the former Soviet bloc, no, that prison was in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was active up until about 12 years before the filming. So that's one of the interesting things about the filming in Air Force One, about how the sets were decided. And so you have this brief moment of triumph for the terrorists, and then lo and behold, Harrison Ford breaks free from his bonds, and he jumps at the terrorist leader and gives him a few knocks. And then there's another one who tries to take a shot at Harrison Ford, and then his Secret Service guy takes the bullet for him, as as sort of the stereotype or custom of the Secret Service agent. You got to take the bullet for the president, sort of thing. And he manages to kill one terrorist who is the pilot, not a smart move, and then he kills the other terrorist. And what ends up happening to Gary Oldman's character, Gary Oldman grabs Harrison Ford's wife and he shoots Gary Oldman, but it hits his Kevlar, so they just fall down the stairs. So now he's got to chase him downstairs. And now there's a lot of the stuff that's like, if anything happens to the general, your wife will die. And then he's making his way to the open cargo area that was opened whenever the hostages jumped, and the terrorist is about to jump, and he's throwing all the parachutes off the plane, saying like, "Aha, you're all stuck here," and whatnot. So then he has to make his little bad guy monologue speech and saying, no matter what happens, you lose and I win. And it's actually kind of a cheesy bad guy. Spoke too long. So, he decided to speak long enough to give the good guy time to make his move, sort of thing. It's very cheesy and stereotypical. But what happens is the president's wife smacks at the gun to her head, and Harrison Ford just takes that opportunity to jump at him. They have a little bit of a ground grappling thing, and then a strap ends up wrapped around the terrorist's neck, and then Harrison Ford pulls the parachute, which is intended to hang the terrorist, and that's when he makes the classic gruff line, "Get off my plane," and then just pushes him off. And maybe Harrison Ford was taking a little something from In the Line of Fire by sort of imitating Clint Eastwood's voice there. So now they have to go upstairs, call off Radek's release, and so Radek ends up being shot. So a lot of the inciting incidents have been resolved, but now how do they land the plane? So there's a MiG fight, even somewhere in that, typical of an action movie. You got to get a good action scene in there. And during the MiG fight, a lot of Air Force One's structural integrity is compromised. So they're going to have to make a rescue landing using the Air Force. And again, pretty airtight plot. This is something that the Air Force actually does. And this is a type of rescue that has been done before by the Air Force by this time that they're making the movie. And so the Air Force finds Air Force One and starts pulling people off of the plane. And so it's down to Harrison Ford's character, the Secret Service agent who actually betrayed them initially, and some guy who I've actually seen in a lot of movies before, but whose name I can't recall. So the guy who was in a bunch of other movies before tells the president, like, go ahead. And then the Secret Service agent who opened up the armory for the terrorists in the first place shoots the guy in the Air Force uniform, and he falls out of the plane. And then or he shoots the Air Force guy who is in charge of the paraline, and then he shoots the guy in the Air Force uniform. And then he says, then he wants the paraline and leave the president to die. They struggle over the paraline. The president gets on the paraline, and then the traitor ends up, dying on the airplane. Not even really in a poetic justice way. It's just kind of meh. It's not even a particularly he's not exactly dying a traitor's death. He's just kind of dying in a meh kind of way. I mean, he's dying in a plane crash, but still, for a plane crash, it's still, I've said this like 3 or 4 times, pretty meh. So, President gets onto the Liberty 24 was the Air Force aircraft that he's on. So he gets onto the airplane and happily ever after. So, um, one of the things that I thought was interesting about this movie was it was actually a childhood favorite of mine. Yeah, a 7-year-old watching a radar movie is not exactly the best idea in the world, but I still liked it. I still watched a lot. I guess, somebody wasn't paying attention to the rating whenever they bought that movie or something. But it was a childhood favorite of mine because, first off, everything to you as a child is interesting whenever it opens up fascinating new worlds. And the fascinating new world was, to me, is there's people that speak other languages. So, because they speak Russian in it, and just like I thought everybody just spoke English or Turkish or Spanish, because those are the only languages that I'd been exposed to by then. So, the it was a childhood favorite of mine, so I'm kind of as familiar with it. Not as much as I am with The Last Samurai, but still pretty familiar with it. And I just wanted to mark that you can actually have an action movie without it being an action porn. And that was one of the things that I really liked about that movie is that it was an action movie, but it took steps to be a little bit something a little bit deeper than My Name is John Rambo or something like that. So I hope you all have enjoyed this review. Like, comment, share, subscribe. And so on Monday, I'll be doing a history segment. I'm not even going to try to forecast what I'm going to do in the future. So I'm